Look at this beast, Giant Gonzalez, 7'7", rippling muscles. The only man to ever look down on the Undertaker with total contempt. But stop. It was the lie of the century. Those muscles? Fake. That skin just painted fabric. The brutal truth hiding inside that rubber suit wasn't supernatural strength. It was a body that was dying by the day. The WWE manufactured a monster by encasing a sick man in a shell of deception, selling his agony for ticket sales. And when the house lights finally went dark, what remained wasn't a legend, but the heartbreaking tragedy of a paper giant, squeezed until his very last breath. Jorge González was born on January 31st, 1966, in El Colorado, a small town in the Formosa province of Argentina. Geographically and culturally, this was a world away from the bright lights of Buenos Aires or the glitzy arenas of North America. Formosa is in the far north of the country, bordering Paraguay. It is a region defined by its heat, its red soil, and its struggle. In the mid-1960s, El Colorado was a place where life was dictated by manual labor and the harvest. It was a humble beginning for a family that expected a humble life. Jorge's parents, Felipe and Valdomira, were people of the earth, hard-working, quiet, and of average stature. When Jorge was born, weighing a robust but not alarming 5.5 kilograms, there was no immediate sign of the genetic storm brewing inside him. For the first few years, Jorge was a typical child. He played in the dirt, he attended the local school, and he fit into the rhythm of village life. But as he approached puberty, the biological traitor awoke. A benign tumor had formed on his pituitary gland. In a healthy body, this gland regulates growth hormones, acting as a master switch that tells the body when to build and when to stop. In Jorge's body, the switch was jammed in the on position. The medical term is gigantism, but the clinical definition fails to capture the visceral horror of the experience for a young boy. This was not just getting tall. It was a violent, rapid expansion of bone and tissue. By the time Jorge was 14 years old, the transformation was undeniable and terrifying. While his classmates were navigating the awkwardness of voice cracks and first crushes, Jorge was growing at a rate that the human skeletal system is not designed to support. Imagine the physical sensation. We often speak of growing pains as a minor childhood annoyance. For Jorge, it was a constant throbbing reality. His long bones, the femurs and tibias, were stretching so fast that his muscles and tendons struggled to keep up. His joints, particularly his knees, were under siege before he even did a day's hard labor. The cartilage was being ground down by the leverage of his own limbs. Then there was the social isolation. In a small town like El Colorado, difference is rarely celebrated. It is stared at. Jorge couldn't hide. He couldn't blend in. By his mid-teens, he was already towering over grown men. Clothes didn't fit. They had to be stitched together from scraps or specially made by his mother. Shoes were an impossibility, forcing him to often go barefoot or wear makeshift sandals. He became a prisoner of his own visibility. He was the freak of El Colorado. Children would point, adults would whisper. For a shy, sensitive boy, which by all accounts Jorge was, this was psychological torture. He developed a hunched posture, a subconscious attempt to shrink himself, to occupy less space in a world that had no room for him. He was a gentle soul trapped in the chassis of a titan. The González family was not wealthy. In the harsh economic climate of rural Argentina, an extra mouth to feed was a burden. A mouth attached to a body that required 3 times the caloric intake of a normal man was a crisis. Jorge felt this burden acutely. He wasn't just a spectacle, he was an expense. Despite his physical awkwardness, he tried to work. He attempted to help with logging and forestry work in the region, hauling wood and using his immense reach to load trucks. But the work was grueling. His back, already under strain from his height, screamed in protest. His heart, forced to pump blood through miles of extra vessels, worked overtime just to keep him standing. It was during this period of manual labor that the dichotomy of his life was established. People saw his size as strength, but in reality, his size was a weakness. He looked like he could move mountains, but he struggled to move himself. In the narrative of every giant, there is a moment of discovery, the moment the outside world invades the sanctuary. For Jorge, that moment came in the form of Oscar Furlong. Furlong was a legend in Argentine basketball. He had been a world champion in 1950 and was a figure of immense respect in the national sporting infrastructure. He was always on the hunt for talent, for height, for the next big thing. Word traveled slowly from Formosa, but rumors of a giant in the north eventually reached the capital. The scouts didn't find a basketball player. They found a curiosity. When they first laid eyes on Jorge, he was roughly 2.15 meters and still growing. He had never touched a basketball. He didn't know the rules. He didn't have the coordination. But in the world of sports scouting, particularly in the 1980s, raw size was the ultimate currency. Skills can be taught. Shooting mechanics can be drilled. But you cannot teach a man to touch the rim without jumping. Furlong and the Argentine Basketball Confederation saw Jorge not as a boy with a medical condition, but as a strategic asset. They approached the González family with a proposition that was impossible to refuse. They would take Jorge to Buenos Aires. They would feed him, house him, clothe him, and pay him. In exchange, he would play for Gimnasia y Esgrima La Plata, and eventually the national team. For the family, this was a lifeline. For Jorge, it was an escape from the red dust of El Colorado. But it was also a pact with the devil. He was selling his body to the state. Jorge arrived in La Plata near Buenos Aires, and the culture shock was absolute. He was a country boy dropped into the chaos of the metropolis. But the training regimen was the real shock. The coaches faced a monumental task. Jorge's motor skills were underdeveloped. His neural pathways, the signals from brain to limb, had to travel longer distances than average, leading to a natural slowness in reaction time. He was clumsy. He tripped over his own feet. Catching a fast pass was a challenge. The training was brutal. They ran him, they made him jump, they tried to build muscle on a frame that was desperate to stay lean. What the coaches didn't fully grasp or chose to ignore was the fragility of his foundation. Acromegaly makes bones large, but it often leaves them brittle or porous. It causes the internal organs to enlarge, putting strain on the system. By forcing Jorge into the regimen of an elite athlete, they were accelerating the breakdown of his body. Every pivot, every landing, every sprint was grinding the meniscus in his knees into dust. Yet he improved. Through sheer will and the fear of returning to poverty, Jorge learned the game. He learned to use his massive frame to block out defenders. He learned to seal off the paint. He wasn't graceful and he wasn't fast, but he was a wall. By 1985, Jorge González had grown to nearly 2.29 meters. He was officially the tallest basketball player in South America. The local press began to call him El Gigante. The narrative had begun. He was no longer Jorge the shy boy. He was a national hope. Argentina, a country that prides itself on sporting excellence, wanted to believe they had a secret weapon. But inside the locker room, the reality was grim. Teammates recall Jorge needing constant ice packs. They remember the sound of his heavy breathing after simple drills. They remember him needing custom-made beds that still weren't big enough, leaving his feet dangling off the edge, his ankles swelling as he slept. He was performing the role of an athlete, but he was physically disintegrating in real time. The tragedy of Jorge González is that his peak performance years were actually years of accelerated decay. He was borrowing time from his future to pay for his present. As the mid-80s approached, the ambition of his handlers grew. South America wasn't enough. The eyes of the Argentine Sporting Commission turned north, to the United States, to the NBA. This was the era of the Cold War in sports, but also the era of global expansion. The NBA was looking for international stars, and in Argentina, there was a man who could look Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the eye and still look down. The stage was set for a journey that would promise him the world, but ultimately cost him his life. By 1986, Jorge González was no longer just a curiosity in the province of Formosa. He was a national project. The Argentine Basketball Confederation had invested heavily in his development, and now they needed a return on that investment. The strategy was clear: showcase the giant of the South to the world. The stage for this unveiling was the 1986 FIBA World Championship in Spain. This tournament was significant not just for the medals, but for the scouting. It was a marketplace. The Cold War was still thawing in the sports world, and the NBA was beginning to look beyond American borders for talent. For Jorge, the trip to Spain was a baptism by fire. He was 20 years old, spoke only Spanish, and had only been playing organized basketball for a few years. Suddenly, he was thrust onto the court against the absolute elite of the sport. This was not the slow, methodical pace of the Argentine regional leagues. This was world-class speed. In Spain, the limitations that would haunt his entire life became painfully obvious. He faced the United States team, led by a young Navy midshipman named David Robinson. Robinson was 7 feet 1 inch, a giant in his own right, but he moved like a sprinter. He was muscle, agility, and power. Jorge, at 7 feet 7 inches, towered over Robinson, yet he was helpless. When Robinson ran the floor, Jorge was left stranding near the key, laboring to turn his massive frame around. The contrast was brutal. One was a superhuman athlete, the other was a medical anomaly trying to play sports. Jorge averaged less than a few minutes per game. He was frequently winded, his face flushed, his knees aching after short bursts of activity. However, the scouts, particularly those from the Atlanta Hawks, didn't look at what Jorge couldn't do. They looked at the one thing he possessed that David Robinson didn't: those extra 6 inches. The philosophy of the NBA in the late 80s was obsessed with size. The thinking was arrogant but simple. We can teach him to run. We can teach him to condition. We can't teach 7'7". 2 years after the exposure in Spain, the gamble was made official. In the 1988 NBA draft, the Atlanta Hawks used their third-round pick to select Jorge González. It is impossible to overstate the cultural magnitude of this moment for Argentina. Jorge was the first Argentine player ever drafted into the NBA. Before Manu Ginobili, before Luis Scola, there was Jorge. The newspapers in Buenos Aires hailed it as a conquest. The poor boy from El Colorado was going to the promised land. He was going to America. But the 54th pick is not a guaranteed contract. It is an invitation to try out. It is a speculative bet. The Hawks were willing to bring him to Atlanta, put him through their training camp, and see if modern American sports science could fix the biological problems that nature had created. Jorge boarded a plane for Atlanta, Georgia. He carried a suitcase of ill-fitting clothes and the weight of an entire nation's expectations. He left behind the red dust of his village for the gleaming skyscrapers of the New South. He didn't know it yet, but he would never truly live in Argentina again. Arrival in the United States was a shock to the system. The language barrier was absolute. Jorge didn't speak a word of English. He was isolated, housed in a hotel, and dependent on translators and handlers for the most basic human needs: ordering food, finding a bathroom, understanding a schedule. The Atlanta Hawks organization, to their credit, tried. They saw Jorge as a potential defensive weapon, a human wall that could simply stand near the basket and deter shots without needing to move much. They paired him with specialized trainers. They put him on a high-calorie diet designed to build muscle mass rather than just bulk. But the NBA game is ruthless. It is a game of lateral movement. It requires the ability to shuffle side to side instantly. When the Hawks trainers put Jorge through agility drills, the results were frightening. His center of gravity was dangerously high. When he tried to change direction quickly, his ankles would roll. His knees, already lacking sufficient cartilage, ground bone on bone. The squeak of his sneakers on the practice court wasn't the sharp chirp of a professional athlete. It was the heavy dragging sound of a man hauling too much cargo. There was also the issue of his hands. Acromegaly causes the hands to continue growing, often becoming thick and fleshy. While large hands are usually an asset in basketball, Jorge's were too large and lacked dexterity. He struggled to feel the ball. His touch was numb. Catching a hard pass from an NBA point guard resulted in fumbles because his reaction time, the neural impulse traveling from eye to brain to hand, was biologically slower. The Hawks medical staff eventually had to face the reality that the scouts had ignored. They ran extensive tests on Jorge. What they found was a ticking time bomb. His heart was enlarged. His circulation was poor, meaning his extremities were constantly at risk of injury and slow to heal. But the deal breaker was the structural integrity of his lower body. The doctors concluded that if Jorge were to play a full 82-game NBA season, the impact of running up and down the hardwood would likely result in catastrophic stress fractures. His legs would essentially shatter under his own weight. The dream was over before the first tip-off. Jorge González would never play a minute of official NBA basketball. This was a devastating psychological blow. Jorge had spent the last 5 years being told he was special, that he was an athlete, that he was the future. Now, he was being told he was physically defective. He was 23 years old, stranded in a foreign country with no skills other than being tall, and his employer had just decided he was useless for the job he was hired to do. He faced a choice: return to Argentina as a failure, back to the poverty and the pity of his hometown, or find another way to survive in America. This is where the unique corporate structure of 1980s Atlanta changed the course of history. The Atlanta Hawks were owned by Ted Turner, the eccentric billionaire founder of CNN and TBS. Turner was building a media empire. Crucially, in 1988, Turner bought Jim Crockett Promotions and rebranded it as World Championship Wrestling. Turner was a businessman who hated wasted assets. He had paid a signing bonus to Jorge. He had paid for his travel and his visa. He wasn't about to let that money walk out the door just because the man couldn't play basketball. The conversation that happened in the Hawks front office likely went something like this: he can't run, he can't jump. But look at him. He's terrifying. Send him to the wrestling school. It was a cold, pragmatic decision. It stripped Jorge of his dignity as a legitimate sportsman and reclassified him as a carnival attraction. He was traded from the sports department to the entertainment department. Jorge had zero interest in professional wrestling. In Argentina, Titanes en el Ring was a popular children's show, but it was seen as comedy, not combat. Jorge considered himself an athlete, not a clown. However, The contract offer from WCW was substantial. It was more money than he could make doing anything else in the world. Driven by the need to support his parents back in El Colorado, and perhaps by a refusal to go home defeated, Jorge accepted. He was sent to the WCW power plant, the company's training facility. This was a dungeon of sweat and testosterone, run by hardened veterans who viewed the business as a sacred brotherhood. They looked at Jorge with skepticism. They saw a basketball reject invading their world. Training to be a wrestler is physically grueling. It involves learning to fall. For a man of normal size, hitting the mat is painful. For a 7'7" man with bad knees and a rigid spine, it was agony. Every time Jorge hit the mat, the shockwave traveled through his fragile skeleton. The trainers quickly realized that Jorge could not wrestle a standard match. He couldn't drop kick. He couldn't be body slammed safely. He couldn't run the ropes. They had to design a completely new style for him, the immovable object. He was taught to stand still, to chop, to choke, and to look menacing. But there was a problem that no amount of training could fix. Jorge was a nice guy. By all accounts from those who knew him in 1989, Jorge was gentle, soft-spoken, and polite. He liked to make jokes. He had a soft smile. Wrestling requires a certain level of acting, of projecting malice. Jorge struggled to find his inner monster because it didn't exist. Despite his limitations, Turner's mandate was clear. Put him on TV. In 1990, Jorge made his debut at the Capital Combat pay-per-view. He walked out not as a villain, but as a fan favorite. They named him El Gigante. The initial reaction was exactly what Turner wanted. The crowd gasped. The commentators screamed. Visually, he was a masterpiece. When he stepped over the top rope without jumping, it broke the brain's understanding of scale. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed to work. He was booked as a hero, a friend of the popular Ric Flair and Sting. He didn't have to do much, just walk in, scare the bad guys, and chop them on the head. The fans cheered. But the novelty of a giant has a very short shelf life. Once the shock wears off, the audience expects action. And action was the one thing Jorge could not provide. As 1991 rolled into 1992, the cheers began to fade. The matches were slow, repetitive, and awkward. Opponents hated working with him because they couldn't perform their usual moves. The magic was evaporating. WCW, realizing they had a statue rather than a star, began to lose interest. Jorge could feel the shift. He was still in pain, still living in hotels, still struggling with English. And now, the fear of unemployment returned. He had failed at basketball. He was failing at wrestling. But in Stamford, Connecticut, a man named Vince McMahon was watching his TV. He didn't see a failed wrestler. He saw a missed opportunity. He saw a man who shouldn't be wearing wrestling trunks and smiling. He saw a monster waiting to be skinned. By late 1992, the writing was on the wall for El Gigante in WCW. The novelty act had grown stale. The company, shifting its focus toward more athletic, dynamic performers, quietly let his contract expire. Jorge González was once again adrift in America, a man too large for the normal world, yet apparently too limited for the wrestling world. But in the ecosystem of professional wrestling, one man's trash is another man's treasure. And in 1993, no one was hungrier for treasure than Vince McMahon, the owner of the World Wrestling Federation. The WWF in the early 90s was a kingdom of cartoons. It was the era of neon spandex, larger-than-life characters, and simple morality plays. McMahon didn't deal in nuance, he dealt in archetypes. He had the ultimate hero in Hulk Hogan, and he had the ultimate supernatural force in The Undertaker. What he needed was a dragon for his knights to slay. When McMahon looked at Jorge, he didn't see the clumsy, smiling El Gigante. He saw raw biological material. He saw height that couldn't be faked. He reportedly told his inner circle, "I don't need him to wrestle. I need him to exist." Jorge signed with the WWF in early 1993. It was the biggest stage in the industry, but the transition would require the total erasure of Jorge González, the human being. Upon his arrival at the WWF headquarters, the creative team faced a stark visual problem. They wanted to present Jorge as an unstoppable, terrifying monster, a prehistoric beast unearthed from the jungles. However, the reality of Jorge's body in 1993 was far from terrifying. It was heartbreaking. The acromegaly was taking a visible toll. While his skeleton was massive, his muscle mass had deteriorated. He was incredibly pale, his skin almost translucent in the harsh arena lights. His arms and legs were long and spindly, looking fragile rather than powerful. He didn't look like a killer, he looked like a patient. If they sent him out in traditional wrestling trunks, the audience wouldn't feel fear. They would feel pity, and pity is the death of a monster heel. To solve this, the WWF costume department created one of the most infamous and ingenious devices in wrestling history, the full body suit. It was a feat of special effects engineering. The suit was a single piece of spandex that covered Jorge from his neck to his ankles. On top of the fabric, artists airbrushed a completely new anatomy. They painted rippling abdominal muscles, bulging pectorals, and defined thighs, muscles that Jorge simply did not possess. To complete the primal illusion, they glued patches of coarse, dark fur onto the shoulders, chest, and crotch area. The intent was to create the look of a yeti or a missing link. The psychological impact of this suit cannot be overstated. It was a second skin, designed to hide the dying man underneath. When Jorge zipped it up, he ceased to be the frail, diabetic man from Argentina. He became an illustration come to life. The suit allowed the audience to suspend their disbelief, but it also trapped Jorge inside a lie. He was literally wearing a healthy body over his sick one. They stripped him of his name. Jorge was too soft. El Gigante was too Spanish. He became simply Giant González. The unveiling was carefully orchestrated. It happened at the Royal Rumble in January 1993. The Undertaker, the company's stoic, invincible dead man, was in the ring dominating his opponents. Then, the music stopped. A low, ominous thudding sound echoed through the arena. Jorge walked out. The visual was staggering. He was wearing the suit. Even next to the 6-foot 10-inch Undertaker, González looked like a skyscraper. The camera angles were manipulated to emphasize his height. The commentators, specifically Bobby the Brain Heenan, sold the moment with panicked screams. Jorge stepped over the top rope, a signature move that emphasized his leg length, and stood face to face with the Undertaker. For the first time in his career, the Undertaker had to look up. The giant chopped the Undertaker. The impact was clumsy, but the symbolism was powerful. He effortlessly tossed the dead man out of the ring like a rag doll. In 5 minutes, the WWF had successfully built a new monster. The crowd was hushed, genuinely awestruck by the sheer geometry of the confrontation. The goal was set: Giant González versus The Undertaker at WrestleMania IX in Las Vegas. This was to be the clash of the Titans. But the road to WrestleMania was paved with anxiety. Behind the curtain, the agents and producers were in a panic. They realized that while the image of González was perfect, the mechanics were broken. Jorge's mobility was worse than ever. The travel schedule of the WWF was grueling. Flying to a different city every night, squeezing his 7 feet 7 inch frame into economy airplane seats, sleeping in beds that were too short. His knees were constantly swollen. His back was in spasms. His handler and on-screen manager was Harvey Whippleman. Whippleman was a small, wiry man with a loud mouth, the perfect visual foil for the Giant. Off camera, Whippleman became Jorge's caretaker. He saw the pain Jorge was in. He saw the struggle to simply walk from the rental car to the hotel room. The creative team had to design the WrestleMania match carefully. It couldn't be a wrestling match. It had to be a brawl. No complex holds, no running, just punches, chokes, and slow movement. The Undertaker, whose real name is Mark Calloway, was known for his ability to get a good match out of anyone. He was a master of ring psychology, but even he was daunted. He later recalled in interviews that his primary concern wasn't the storyline, it was safety. "I was trying to make him look like a monster," Calloway said, "but I was terrified. I was going to break him." WrestleMania IX took place outdoors at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. It was a hot, bright afternoon. The daylight was cruel to the illusion. Without the moody arena lighting, the airbrushed muscles on Jorge's suit looked fake. The fur looked like glued-on scraps. The magic was already thinning. The match itself is infamous. It was slow, painfully slow. Jorge moved like he was underwater. Every step seemed calculated to avoid a fall. The Undertaker tried to attack him, flying off the ropes, but Jorge could only absorb the blows stiffly. He couldn't bend to sell the impact. Then came the finish, a moment that exposed the corner the WWF had painted themselves into. In wrestling, the climax usually involves a finishing move. The Undertaker's finisher was the Tombstone Piledriver, a move where he picks the opponent up upside down and drives their head into the mat. There was absolutely no way the Undertaker could perform this move on Jorge. Jorge was too tall to be lifted safely, and his spine was too fragile to take the impact. Even a chokeslam was deemed too risky. Jorge's hips might shatter. So how does the hero beat the villain if he can't hit him? The writers came up with a desperate, nonsensical solution. Harvey Whippleman threw a rag soaked in chloroform into the ring. Jorge picked it up and smothered the Undertaker's face with it. The referee called for the bell. The Undertaker was disqualified or knocked out. It was a disqualification victory for the Undertaker because of the use of a foreign object. The crowd in Las Vegas went silent, then confused. The monster hadn't been beaten. He had just cheated in a weird way. Then, to send the fans home happy, the Undertaker woke up from the chloroform, attacked the Giant, and knocked him over with a flying clothesline. It was the only bump Jorge took. He fell back like a falling tree. It was the best he could do. After WrestleMania, the aura was gone. The monster had been revealed as a man in a rubber suit who couldn't fight. The WWF kept him on the payroll for a few more months, trying to squeeze the last drops of value from the investment. He had a rematch with The Undertaker at SummerSlam 1993. It was meant to be the rest in peace match. It was even sadder than the first. The novelty was dead. The fans were bored. They chanted boring at the 7'7" marvel. In that match, The Undertaker finally defeated him decisively. Afterward, the WWF attempted a face turn. The storyline was that Harvey Whippleman had been abusing him, and the Giant finally snapped, throwing his manager to the wolves. It was a glimpse of the real Jorge, the gentle man who just wanted to be liked. But it was too little, too late. The WWF audience in 1993 wanted edge and attitude, and the dawn of the new generation era was focusing on athleticism and work rate. There was no place for a static giant anymore. When the World Wrestling Federation released Jorge González in October 1993, the silence that followed was deafening. For nearly a year, his life had been a whirlwind of airports, sold-out arenas, and the chaotic energy of the WWF machine. He had been the primary antagonist to the company's biggest star. He had been on posters, lunchboxes, and trading cards. Now he was just a 27-year-old man sitting in a rented apartment, staring at a phone that had stopped ringing. The airbrushed suit, the skin that had made him valuable, was property of the WWF. Without it, he was no longer Giant González. He was just Jorge again, but a version of Jorge that was significantly more damaged than the one who had arrived in America 5 years earlier. The psychological toll of this period was immense. Jorge had never truly integrated into American society. He still spoke broken English. His social circle was almost exclusively limited to the wrestlers he traveled with. And in the transient world of professional wrestling, friendships evaporate the moment you leave the locker room. He was alone, stranded in the limbo between celebrity and obsolescence. But the financial pressure remained. The money he had made in the WWF was substantial compared to wages in El Colorado, but it was not retirement money. Between taxes, agent fees, the cost of living on the road, and sending money back to his parents in Argentina, his savings were modest. He needed to work. In the 1990s, when a wrestler's career in the United States faltered, there was usually one remaining sanctuary: Japan. The Japanese wrestling culture has a long-standing fascination with giants. Historically, legends like Andre the Giant and Giant Baba were treated with reverence in Tokyo, viewed not as circus freaks, but as godlike figures of power. Japan was the last place where size alone could still sell tickets. In 1994, New Japan Pro Wrestling, one of the most prestigious promotions in the world, booked Jorge. They billed him once again as El Gigante. They hoped that the sheer spectacle of a 7'7" man would be enough to draw crowds. However, the Japanese style of wrestling is fundamentally different from the American theatrical style. It is called strong style. It emphasizes physical impact, realism, and endurance. It is a sport where credibility is built on the ability to take punishment. For Jorge, Japan was a physical nightmare. The rings in Japan were harder. The travel, often by bus and bullet train, was cramped. But the cruelest aspect was the expectation of the audience. They wanted to see the giant fight. Footage from his matches in Japan during 1994 and early 1995 reveals a heartbreaking decline. He looked heavier, not muscular, but bloated. The fluid retention caused by his failing kidneys and poor circulation was becoming visible in his face and ankles. He moved with a heartbreaking caution. Every step looked like he was testing the floorboards to see if they would hold him. He was booked against legendary fighters like the great Muta. In these matches, Muta, a master of agility, would run circles around Jorge. Jorge would stand in the center, swiping his massive arms like a tired bear fighting off bees. The matches were short, often ending in disqualifications or countouts to protect Jorge from having to take a fall. The Japanese fans, knowledgeable and discerning, saw through it. They didn't boo him with malice. They watched him with a polite, uncomfortable silence. They saw a man who shouldn't be there. The godlike aura was gone. He was just a man in pain, performing for a paycheck. By late 1995, the Japanese bookings were drying up. Jorge was running out of options. His body was screaming for rest. His knees were bone on bone. He was developing constant thirst and fatigue, classic symptoms of unmanaged type 2 diabetes, a common comorbidity of acromegaly that was ravaging his system. Then a lifeline appeared from the past. World Championship Wrestling, now in the midst of the Monday Night Wars against the WWF, reached out. The company was now run by Eric Bischoff and was throwing money around to acquire talent. They had a new absurd idea for a storyline involving a monster encased in a block of ice who would break out to destroy Hulk Hogan. They called the character the Yeti. The creative team remembered Jorge. They remembered El Gigante. They needed someone massive to play the role. They didn't care about his wrestling ability. They just needed the silhouette. They offered him a contract for a one-night appearance at the Halloween Havoc pay-per-view in Detroit, Michigan in October 1995. It was a chance for a comeback, a chance to get back on U.S. national television, a chance to secure another year of medical insurance and salary. Despite his deteriorating health, Jorge accepted. He packed his bags for Detroit. The events of October 1995 are often misremembered by wrestling history, but they represent the tragic climax of Jorge's career. Fans who watched Halloween Havoc 1995 remember the Yeti appearing at the end of the show. A tall figure wrapped from head to toe in white bandages like a mummy, who came out and bear-hugged Hulk Hogan. Jorge flew to Detroit. He checked into the wrestler's hotel, but he never made it to the arena. In his hotel room, the biological debt he had been accumulating for years finally came due. He fell violently ill. It was a diabetic emergency, likely diabetic ketoacidosis, compounded by the stress of travel and his underlying acromegaly. He collapsed. He was disoriented, weak, and unable to stand. The giant who was supposed to terrorize Hulk Hogan couldn't even lift himself off the hotel floor. When the WCW agents realized Jorge was incapacitated, the cold machinery of the business took over instantly. There was no time for sympathy. There was a show to run. The script called for a giant mummy, so they needed a giant mummy. They looked around the locker room and found Ron Reese, another very tall wrestler who was under contract. They put Reese in the mummy bandages. Because the costume covered the entire face and body, the audience would never know the difference. The show went on. Ron Reese walked out as the Yeti. The fans cheered and booed. The pyrotechnics went off. The credits rolled. Meanwhile, upstairs in a hotel room, the real giant was lying in darkness, his career ending not with a roar, but with a medical collapse. He had been replaced by a suit of bandages, just as he had been defined by a suit of muscles in the WWF. He was interchangeable. He was disposable. The aftermath of the Detroit incident was swift and brutal. WCW realized that Jorge was a liability. He was uninsurable. He could not perform. The offer for a longer contract was immediately rescinded. There was no exit interview. There was no severance package to thank him for his years of service to the industry. The logic was transactional. The asset is broken. Return to sender. Jorge was put on a plane back to Argentina. The flight home must have been an agonizing experience, both physically and emotionally, sitting in a cramped economy seat for 10 hours with failing kidneys and swollen legs, staring out the window, knowing that he was returning to El Colorado with nothing. He had left Argentina in 1988 as a hero, the NBA draft pick, the Golden Boy. He was returning in 1995 as a physically broken man twice rejected by the American entertainment machine. He carried with him the shame of failure, the pain of a crumbling body, and the terrifying realization that he had no skills to survive the next chapter of his life. He was 29 years old. His career as a global spectacle was over. The lights were off. The noise was gone. Now, the real suffering, the slow, quiet suffering of the forgotten, was about to begin. The return of Jorge González to El Colorado in late 1995 was not a homecoming parade. It was a retreat into obscurity. 7 years earlier, he had boarded a plane to the United States as a symbol of infinite possibility, a basketball prodigy destined to conquer the world. He returned as a physical wreck, carrying a suitcase full of oversized clothes and a body that was rapidly failing him. The province of Formosa is a world away from the neon lights of Tokyo or the arenas of Las Vegas. It is a region of red earth, intense heat, and simple agrarian rhythms. For a man of standard proportions, life there is hard but manageable. For a man standing 7 feet 7 inches, the infrastructure of a rural town is not just inconvenient, it is hostile. Upon his return, the local perception of Jorge shifted instantly. He was no longer the distant celebrity seen on television clips. He was a neighbor again, but the awe had been replaced by a quiet, pervasive pity. The townspeople saw the way he walked, the slow, agonizing shuffle of feet that had lost all sensation due to neuropathy. They saw the way he had to duck almost double to enter a doorway. They saw the monster of the WWF stripped of his costume, revealed as a tired son living back with his parents, trying to fit into a world that was simply too small for him. One of the most persistent questions surrounding Jorge's later years is where the money went. There is a common assumption that anyone who appears on American television, particularly in major organizations like the NBA or WWF, is set for life. The reality for Jorge was starkly different. While he had earned decent money by the standards of the early 1990s, his burn rate was astronomical. Being a giant is an incredibly expensive existence. Jorge could not buy clothes off the rack. Everything had to be custom tailored, costing triple the normal price. He could not fit in a standard economy car. He required specialized transport or first-class tickets simply to accommodate the length of his legs, expenses that were not always covered by promoters. Furthermore, Jorge was financially illiterate and navigating a foreign system. Handlers, agents, and hangers-on had taken their cuts, and he had dutifully sent significant amounts of cash back to his family in Argentina to improve their lives, prioritizing their comfort over his own long-term security. By 1996, the accounts were draining fast. There were no royalties to fall back on. The business model of that era did not pay residuals to talent for past video sales. Every time a kid bought a WrestleMania IX VHS tape to watch the Giant fight the Undertaker, Jorge received absolutely nothing. He had been a contract laborer, paid for his time, and when the time ended, so did the income. With the distraction of the road and the adrenaline of performance gone, the medical reality of acromegaly took center stage. In the United States, Jorge had access, however sporadic, to advanced medical monitoring. Back in rural Argentina, the healthcare system was ill-equipped to handle a case of his biological complexity. Acromegaly is a rare endocrine disorder that requires specialists, advanced imaging, and expensive medication to suppress growth hormone levels. In Formosa, these resources were scarce. The tumor on his pituitary gland, likely untreated or undertreated during his wrestling years, had done irreversible damage, but the immediate killer was the diabetes. Type 2 diabetes in a giant is a metabolic nightmare. His massive body required immense amounts of energy, creating a voracious appetite. Yet his ability to process sugar was shattered. His blood glucose levels swung violently, and the most debilitating effect was on his kidneys. The kidneys are the body's filtration system, and Jorge's were tasked with filtering blood for a body twice the size of a normal human while being bombarded by toxic sugar levels. By the late 90s, they were beginning to shut down. The years between 1997 and 2000 were defined by a shrinking world. Jorge moved to a modest house in the town of San Martin, and his life, once played out in sold-out stadiums, was now confined to a few rooms. Furniture became a daily torture. Standard chairs would buckle under his weight, and beds were never long enough, forcing him to sleep with his feet propped up on chairs or dangling off the edge, which exacerbated the severe edema in his ankles. He tried to maintain some independence with stories of him attempting to drive modified vehicles with his knees jammed against the dashboard, but eventually, mobility became impossible. The neuropathy in his feet meant he couldn't feel the pedals, making the risk too high. So he spent his days sitting, just sitting. The cruelest irony of this isolation was what played out on the screen in front of him. In the late 90s, professional wrestling exploded into its biggest boom period ever, the Attitude Era. The WWF became a global pop culture phenomenon. Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock were making millions of dollars, and The Undertaker, his old rival, was reinventing himself into an icon. Jorge watched this from a small TV in a dark room in Argentina. He saw the company that had discarded him reach unprecedented heights. He saw the industry that had chewed up his body making billions of dollars. Friends say he rarely expressed bitterness, but the psychological weight of that isolation must have been crushing. He was a ghost watching the party continue without him, fully aware that the machine had moved on. Desperation eventually set in as his condition worsened. The family knew he was dying and sought help, but traveling a 7'7" 400-pound man who can barely walk is a massive logistical operation requiring ambulances and specialized stretchers. The Argentine public health care system covered the basics, but Jorge needed dialysis. His kidneys were failing. Dialysis is a grueling process for a normal person, but for Jorge, the volume of blood and the size of his veins presented unique challenges. He began the cycle that would define the rest of his life. The agonizing trip to the clinic 3 times a week, the struggle to get into the vehicle, the hours hooked to a machine, and the utter exhaustion that followed. As the millennium turned, a new symptom emerged, perhaps the most terrifying of all: retinopathy. The high blood sugar was systematically destroying the tiny blood vessels in his eyes. Jorge began to lose his vision. At first it was a blur, a difficulty focusing on faces. Then came the shadows. Then the darkness. For a man whose entire life had been defined by being seen, by being the biggest thing in the room, going blind was a profound psychological blow. He could no longer watch the basketball games he loved. He could no longer read. He became a prisoner in his own body, dependent entirely on his family to feed him, guide him to the bathroom, and manage his medication. The monster who had terrified children on Saturday morning cartoons was now a blind, crippled man in his early 30s, crying out in pain because his bones felt like they were splintering. In professional wrestling, there is often talk of brotherhood, a claim that wrestlers look out for their own. But in reality, it is a business of out of sight, out of mind. During these dark years in San Martin, the phone rarely rang. The stars he had worked with, Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, the executives at WWF, were worlds away. There were no charity fundraisers organized by the major promotions, no documentaries checking in on him. To the wrestling business, Giant González was a failed gimmick, an embarrassing footnote from a bad year that was best forgotten. They had erased him from the history books, but he was not entirely forgotten. In the era before social media, rumors began to circulate on early internet wrestling forums. Fans asked if he was dead or if the stories of his sickness were true. These whispers eventually reached the ears of the one man who had looked him in the eye every day for 2 years, the one man who remembered that inside the rubber suit there was a person. Bruno Lauer, known to the world as the villainous manager Harvey Whippleman, heard the rumors in Memphis, Tennessee. He didn't just scroll past, he found a phone number, he dialed the country code for Argentina. And in the darkness of a room in San Martin, the phone finally rang. The ringing phone in the dark room in San Martin was a lifeline, thrown across a hemisphere. On the other end of the line was Bruno Lauer, the man the world knew as Harvey Whippleman, the shrill, abusive manager who had spent 2 years on television screaming at Giant González. But the dynamic in reality was the inverse of the fiction. In the wrestling storylines, Whippleman was the master and González the slave. In life, they were simply two men who had shared the trenches of a bizarre war, and Lauer was the only soldier who had come back for his wounded comrade. When Lauer learned of Jorge's condition, that the Giant was bankrupt, blind, and struggling to afford the basic medical supplies needed to stay alive, he didn't offer thoughts and prayers. He offered his bank account. For the next several years, a quiet unilateral humanitarian mission took place, entirely unknown to the wrestling dirt sheets or the fans debating match quality on the internet. Lauer began sending money to Argentina. It wasn't a corporate tax write-off. It was personal income, sent month after month to pay for dialysis treatments, for insulin, for food, and for the retrofitting of Jorge's home to accommodate a wheelchair. It is a detail that reshapes the entire narrative of Jorge's life. The industry that had profited from his gigantism had abandoned him the moment his knees buckled, but the villain of the story, a man who had made his living playing a weasel, proved to be the only one with the moral backbone to act. Jorge often told his family that without Bruno, he would have died years earlier. It was a friendship forged in the absurd fires of the WWF, surviving the silence of a decade. By the mid-2000s, Jorge's existence had become a small, repetitive loop of survival. The town of San Martin, with its dirt roads and oppressive heat, was his entire world. He was now permanently confined to a wheelchair. The acromegaly had continued to wreak havoc on his skeletal structure, fusing joints and rendering his massive legs useless. But the cruelest affliction remained the diabetes. It had stolen his sight almost completely. He spent his days listening. He listened to the sounds of the farm, to the radio, and to the voices of his family. He was a prisoner in the dark, trapped inside a body that was still, ironically, growing in subtle, painful ways even as it was dying. The specific tragedy of his final years was the lucidity of his mind. Jorge was not senile. He was fully aware of his situation. He knew he was a burden to his aging parents. He knew the world had moved on. He sat in his chair, a living monument to a bygone era, waiting for the inevitable. In 2010, a few months before the end, a local documentary crew visited him. The footage from this encounter is difficult to watch but necessary to witness. It strips away the last remnants of the Giant González myth. There is no airbrushed suit, no thunderous entrance music. There is just a swollen, exhausted man sitting in a specialized wheelchair that looks more like a hospital bed. His face, once defined by the sharp, prominent jawline of acromegaly, was puffy and tired. He spoke softly, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to emanate from the bottom of a well. He didn't speak of wrestling with anger. He spoke of it with a distant, detached nostalgia like a dream he once had. He acknowledged the pain, the bad contracts, and the exploitation, but he lacked the energy for rage. He was simply a man who was ready to rest. He admitted that his greatest regret was not the wrestling career itself, but the fact that he could never return the favor to his parents, that instead of being their provider, he had become their child again. The end came in September 2010. The biological machinery finally ground to a halt. His kidneys, which had been performing a Herculean task for 44 years, failed completely. The heart, tasked with pumping blood through 7.5 feet of compromised vasculature, gave out. On September 22, 2010, Jorge González died in the hospital in San Martin. He was 44 years old. The news traveled slowly. It didn't break on ESPN or CNN immediately. It trickled out through wrestling forums and Argentine news sites. When the obituary finally ran, it was brief. Former NBA draftee and WWF wrestler passes away. It was a footnote. The funeral in El Colorado was a humble affair, attended by family, neighbors, and the few locals who remembered him not as a monster, but as the shy boy who grew too fast. There were no 10-bell salutes on Monday Night Raw that week. There was no video package set to sad music aired to millions of viewers. The wrestling world, busy with its next pay-per-view, barely paused. The contrast was staggering. A man who had performed in front of 40,000 people at Caesar's Palace was laid to rest in the red soil of Formosa with almost zero fanfare from the industry that made him famous. The only bridge between those two worlds was the grief of Bruno Lauer, thousands of miles away in Tennessee, mourning the friend he had kept alive for as long as he could. Jorge's death was the closing of a circle. He had been born in obscurity, plucked out by the hand of commerce to be a spectacle, used until he broke, and then returned to obscurity to die. But in that silence, the truth of his life finally became clear. He wasn't a wrestler who failed. He was a man who survived. He survived a body that was trying to kill him from the day he was born. He survived the culture shock of America. He survived the humiliation of the Yeti costume and the airbrushed muscles. He endured pain that would have broken a smaller man in half, and he did it to send money home to his mother. The paper monster had finally been laid to rest, leaving behind a legacy that was far more human and far more tragic than any script Vince McMahon could have written.